thank you so much, So-Young. It's really nice to be with all of you this morning. Don't worry, we're going to make up some time here. So as much as possible, I'd ask you to keep your thoughts concise and on point. One of the things that I learned this morning was that I need to hang out with Sandy and Bob more because they're going to some awesome places, and all I seem to do is just go to my lab here on campus. So that was one of my big takeaways. So yesterday at our meeting, one of the questions that was asked of us discussing this new center is these three words: sustainable, digital, and finance. When they're put together, it can mean many different things. Is it about sustainable finance digitally? Is it about sustainable digitization of finance? Is it about something else? And we heard a number of different reactions on that. And so I guess the first thing I'd like to hear from you, and if we could start with Juliet and kind of move this way down the panel, what does it mean to you, and what do you think is the real potential here?
Thanks, Mike. First, let me just clarify the introduction. It's former chair of Jumia Nigeria and former group chief sustainability officer for the group here. Yeah, great question, Mike, and we talked about it yesterday. So for me, the principal way I look at it is, what problem are we solving, right? The center is designed to solve problems. And from the demographic, which is the global south as it is described by the World Bank, where I live, it's really looking around how this impacts people in emerging markets. So for me, sustainable digital finance is about how to ensure that we're providing access to people in emerging markets, especially people who are currently traditionally excluded from the traditional financial services, either because they lack access to digital tools, or they have access to digital tools, but still, because of certain other impediments, they're not able to access financial services effectively. So that's very important. So access from a consumer perspective, utilizing digital finance technology, for me, is part of sustainability from that perspective. And then the second part of it, which makes it sustainable for me, is also from ensuring that in providing access, we don't lose security of the assets, and we provide consumer protection as well. So that's what is going to make it long-term and sustainable. That's my perspective on it.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So, Rama, what do you think?
I was hoping we'll start there. I'll hear a bit more. I don't know, to be honest.
Actually, that was a very common answer yesterday. So do not be.
I sent a note to Thomas yesterday asking him to clarify the definition. Look, I work at JP Morgan. The sustainable finance piece is what I do every day, all day. And the way I think about it, so I'll focus on those, and we'll try to weave in digital part of it. The problem of, and again, I'm thinking more or less about climate exclusively. Obviously there are lots of other issues that are related. We think of the problem in kind of four big buckets. One is, how do you scale mature technology like solar, wind, EVs, etc.? Second is, how do you catalyze emerging technology like green hydrogen or carbon capture or SAF, etc.? Third is, how do you wind down responsibly the financing of fossil fuel infrastructure? And then the fourth is, how do you keep score of how you're doing across the other three things, right? And technology, broadly speaking, has a role to play in all of those. Simple use cases that where, again, perhaps if you think broadly, fall into the definition of sustainable digital finance. We don't have time, right? The typical kind of, revolutions happened with decades of industry research and academic research and government-funded research, and then you can start thinking about commercial applications. For solving climate change, I don't think we have the time.
Yeah.
So we have to really accelerate a lot of this. So things like, trying to use digital clones and digital twins to try out different things in a lab setting before you actually scale in the market is something that we have spent time on. We work with companies who are doing that. That way, again, the cycle can be shortened. We spend a lot of time thinking about, like, again, measurement techniques like methane leaks from gas pipelines, right? So it's a huge issue. Methane is exceptionally bad for the environment, far more than CO2 is. But there is really no, historically, there's never been a very good way of measuring that. And so there's a lot of technology, right? People are doing either drone technology or satellite technology or measurement pads at site. So things like that gives us better data as a financier, so I can actually finance it. I can finance it more credibly that what I'm doing actually is sustainable, rather than somebody telling me I think I have the right tools in place. So things like that, I think, fall into this bucket. Then there's the whole risk aspect of it. As a bank with a $4 trillion balance sheet, obviously we think about climate risk a lot, and data to measure the climate risk is very, very important to us. If you're making a 30-year mortgage in San Francisco, I have to factor in the climate impacts, right? Because I'm not quite sure what's going to happen to this place in 30 years. So the more data I can get, right, GPS data, climate data, etc., is very valuable. So to me, perhaps those are the kinds of things where technology broadly defined intersects with sustainable finance.
So one of the things that and it's 4 trillion today, right? Could be more.
Our balance sheet?
Yeah.
The rate at which
could be easily more
more
next week.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I think is important in that regard is that you talked about the timing and how quickly we need to solve some of these problems. I think working between research, working between young entrepreneurs, startups, the developing world, and the large major corporations, of which we have some great examples here on stage, is going to be key, because we've got great ideas. We need a lot of help scaling them, and that's absolutely where I think that the partnership becomes so important.
Absolutely right. Unlike the tech revolution, this is an asset-heavy revolution.
Yeah.
I don't think two guys in a garage, no offense to the Stanford community, can solve the problem, right? This needs capital, right?
We're running a seminar class right now on how is entrepreneurship in climate and sustainability different, and a lot of the discussions focus around size and scale. So you talked a little about digital twins, you talked about how we can do things at a faster rate. Ashby, I know we've talked about this a lot, and so what do you think the opportunity is for sustainable digital finance? What does that mean?
My gosh.
And how does that work?
It's so exciting. In seeing these presentations this morning, I am almost jealous of the cool ideas you guys are pulling together into a single center. One of the numbers up on the screen was 185 trillion capital markets. So that's my world. I study the capital markets, and I study the base of capital markets, which is the pension funds, the sovereign funds, the endowments, the foundations, the insurance companies. I usually say it's about 120 trillion, so I've got to go and look at your data, so young, to see where you've got the 185 trillion, but I'll take it and I'll start citing it. I'm happy to sound bigger than I am. But 120 trillion is big on its own, and people pay attention when I say that number. No offense to your 4 trillion, but 185 is big.
No, I do.
But look, I think these organizations, the first thing to just say is, like, these organizations are strange. Pension funds, sovereign funds, endowments. You can get a PhD from Stanford and not really know what they do. Yeah, they have $120 trillion, but we don't really teach much about why plan sponsors establish these organizations, why their assets are compounding in a tax-free environment, why contributions to these plans are tax-free, why governments want a sovereign fund. Why are we incentivizing the pooling of this capital as a society in these beneficial investment organizations? There's a lot not known about these organizations that happen to be putting all of the capital in capitalism today, at least the risk capital. Venture funds, private equity funds, infrastructure funds, real estate funds, they get their money from pension funds. right? I think Bob said earlier, it's like their money. The managers do what they tell them. But they're also living in bureaucracies. They exist in governments. They sit inside universities. They are strange. It isn't easy to understand what they're optimizing for. And so when I think of sustainable digital finance, I think about coming to these organizations that operate in process-driven, bureaucratic decision-making frameworks and present them with facts. So when Sandy said, I present people with facts and they change their mind, that's what I do with the world of pension funds. Today, they use knowledge. They look at your experience, they look at your track record over a certain number of years, they look at your assets under management, and they infer skill. And they infer that skill and they infer capability in the absence of clean data, useful information, and new knowledge built on that foundation.
Because assets under management is always a clear indicator of
It's
skill.
a great indicator of nothing. It is a great indicator that you're going to overpay for whatever asset management service you're about to consume, okay? So if you're waiting for Fund 3, as CalPERS has to do, which is our biggest pension plan here, you know you're going to pay full freight, and you know you're going to get a strategy that isn't really climate sensitive, that isn't really sustainable, because it's already been built. It goes back 20 years. For the new knowledge to emerge, we need new fund managers, new strategies, new ideas. We need innovation. And in these organizations that are sitting inside universities or foundations or government, innovation is hard. They're not designed to innovate. So the digital piece in this, new facts, new evidence that change is required, that's the work that I'm excited about.
Very cool, very cool. Ellen, what are your thoughts?
Sure. Well, coming from MasterCard, where we're the payments network that ties a lot of these concepts together. When I think about these words, sustainable digital finance, two things. One, which you've touched on, was around inclusion, and that's really been important to MasterCard. So, for over 10 years, we've had our Center for Inclusive Growth that's focused on financial inclusion. And so the fact that the center now has that built into the core of how we're viewing the progress that we need going forward, I think is really important. It's important to us. But it's the marriage of, when you think about ESG, the E plus the S. So how do we make sure we're not thinking about making decisions kind of in silos like we have primarily in the past? Where we're looking at financial inclusion as only a social impact play, and not how financial inclusion can be a tool to drive sustainable consumption or a tool for climate resilience and adaptation. And so I think pulling those two concepts together underneath the center, I'm really excited about that. And so for us, in terms of our own strategy, our network is quite massive. We have 90 million merchants, 20,000 banking partners, and 3 billion cardholders. And obviously, again, thinking about that financial inclusion lens, we're focused on expanding that base of cardholders to
You
everyone.
say 3 billion cardholders?
3 billion.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
8 billion people on planet Earth. We have a relationship with 3 billion, and we can also see the consumption habits of those 3 billion people. So how do we leverage the power of this network to drive more sustainable choices? So our strategies around informing, so not judging, not shaming, right? But just providing true, accurate information. I think we're going to talk about some of the challenges here.
Yeah.
How do you get that accurate information? That's essential. Greenwashing in, greenwashing out. Bad data in, bad data out, bad decisions. So we're really excited about this concept of the E plus the S, putting sustainability, climate decisions together with social impact and financial inclusion.
Wow. You've had basically no time to think about your answer here. So this has got to be really good, right? So what do you think sustainable digital finance?
When I sat here, I was wondering, is this the good seat or the bad seat? Either I have to go first or I have to go last.
Everything's
So,
already been said, and so you
yeah.
can just say, oh yeah.
yeah, well, hopefully I can offer a bit of a new insight. And I think my answer here is really based on where I'm coming from, which is the Stellar Development Foundation. That is a nonprofit that supports the growth and development of the Stellar Network, which is a public blockchain network. before. Hopefully some of you are not, getting a little cringe like, ooh, crypto. But, I think we're doing a lot of interesting work, and I'm hoping that kind of that vantage point here is the Stellar Development Foundation, our mission is to create equitable access to the global financial system. And so I think my answer to how to, sustainable digital finance comes at one, that technology layer we're talking about. How can the technology itself drive sustainability? And then how can the applications of it, those products and services built on top of it, also foster greater sustainable digital finance? So for example, and I think this might shock some folks who are maybe not super familiar with blockchain, but blockchain can be a sustainable technology. I know a lot of people conflate it with Bitcoin, but the Stellar Network, for example, is very efficient and very low carbon footprint. So how could you use that to make certain processes more efficient, right? So actually address sustainability and technology, and maybe get rid of certain duplicative processes in the existing traditional financial system. So I think there's a lot of ways that real-time settlement, for example, and we'll get into use cases, but so I think there's a lot of opportunity there. And then on the flip side, the application side. For example, I just actually got off a plane from Argentina, speaking of going to cool places.
Oh yeah, wait a minute.
I just got off a plane from Argentina where they're clearly suffering from, huge inflation. And I think when we're thinking about sustainable digital finance, I just witnessed firsthand all these kind of creative mechanisms they have to kind of have a safe store of value. And I think things, certain things like stable coins, when a one-to-one backed fiat token, maybe I'm getting too technical here, but I can explain that a little more later, like USDC gives folks in these kinds of geographies access to stable stores of value, which I think, again, is like a really powerful thing, digital financial tool to give to people. So I guess for me, it's both on the technology and the application side is kind of how I'm thinking about it.
One of the things you said was about using the digital component of this to make it more efficient and to try to allow payments to settle quicker and the velocity of the money system to increase potentially. And this is something that at our center, sustainable development and global competitiveness, we've always seen these two things going together in being able to, yes, achieve sustainable development while also increasing global competitiveness from an inclusion standpoint. So first of all, thank you for all of those viewpoints. I'm going to jump around the panel a little bit. I first want to talk about some opportunities for use cases, and we'll start with Juliet. If there were an interesting use case that you would want to see go as a first demonstration, what kind of use case would you think, and what characteristics would it have? And then I want to jump over here to Lauren on that one as well.
Yeah, I think one jumps right out of my head as you say that, and that's around, and we talked about it yesterday, around capital formation. Because again, forgive me if I keep going back emerging markets, because that's the market where I've worked quite a lot in. You find that a lot of the opportunities, right, are sort of concentrated in a few individuals or a few companies and so on, and therefore you don't have this kind of what you call the trickle-down effect of economic growth. Okay. Now, the faster way to do that, to really encourage that economic growth that trickles down across board and a lot more people benefit from it, is to be able to form capital that is then deployed to income-generating assets or projects, right? In a way that there's retail capital that invests in it, and therefore the simple guy who just has $50 or $100 to invest can take that opportunity. And that's a great way to use, maybe it's blockchain technologies. I'm just thinking, what if we could launch a new project utilizing blockchain technology to develop an infrastructure asset, which could be a train station, a train service, or it could be a new hydro plant that serves a certain community. But because it's blockchain, and it's allowed to be, it allows people to have access to it, to be able to invest in it in small tokenized fashion, rather than a big company taking all the investment. That could really, really create a big opportunity and the inclusion that that is very critical in this market. That's one use case that for me would be really, really exciting to see happen.
And the thing I appreciate about that is, you can easily say, I'm a professor of civil and environmental engineering. What do I know about any one of the words in these three things? And so much, and Bob alluded to it this morning, so much of what we need to do to think about sustainability globally are hard, on the ground infrastructure projects to give people the dignity and quality of life that we all deserve. And so I really appreciate that you think there's a space for that. All right, Lauren, what would you want to do?
Okay, I think I'm gonna start with the one, there are a lot, but the one that I think I really want to focus on is actually one that I think is already happening today and that we see traction, and obviously it's early days, but is in cross-border payments and remittances. I think even, the World Bank, the G20, all kind of see the opportunity of blockchain technology, particularly to address this, to move money quicker and more affordably cross borders. And last year, I think it was the World Bank Fund that was 630 billion in remittances went to low and middle income countries. So how can we, give them the tools to do that more quickly and affordably? And so I think some use cases we're seeing on the Stellar Network, because the Stellar Network, it's, you can send payments in 5 to 7 seconds, and it's really cheap for the developer to send. So so the cost of sending money is very cheap. That it's enabling that for people. So a couple of use cases actually that are happening today. So one is Felix Pago, and they're based in Mexico, and they let U.S. Folks in the U.S. send money via WhatsApp to their families or friends in Mexico. And they can, first it obfuscates all of the blockchain part of it that might be confusing and gives them that way to send a remittance really quickly and easily. And then the other thing I'll say is, the way we think about it is actually not that blockchain will be kind of this parallel system and people, they send their money to WhatsApp, but then what do you do with it? And when you think about there's some 60% of the adult workforce who still gets paid in the informal economy, meaning in cash, they get that money. Where are they going to do that? Which is why partnerships with traditional finance for us are really important. So we partnered with MoneyGram last year, and so things people can do now is they get their remittance and then they walk into a MoneyGram, and to use the term we use is off-ramp, right? You can cash out into your local currency. So I think these are things that maybe sometimes don't seem as sexy in terms of access to finance, but it's a way that you actually can bring people into the digital economy, because they might be cash based, but now you say, hey, you know what? You have this digital wallet, you got a remittance from your family, and now you can bring it into your local currency and actually spend it.
Yeah, and those kind of foundational, really important projects are not always the ones that are the splashy projects like that, but they're so important from the equity and sustainability piece. So you talked about partnerships. Now I get to talk to Ram about this. So okay, we got some use cases. Right? Going to a big partner like JP Morgan, and that is a big partner. How do we think about use cases that for you are interesting, are potentially scalable, are basically worth your time? Because you have so many options for projects to be able to do, I would imagine. You have to be able to prioritize, and you can't do everything.
Well, since we're talking dirty anyhow with blockchain, I'll double down.
Since we're talking dirty, let's talk dirty. All right.
Let's talk dirty. Carbon offsets.
Carbon offsets. All right.
Look, people have, again, this is not necessarily a use case I'm advocating strongly for, but an interesting one regardless. I don't know how well people know carbon offsets. It's a way to essentially pay money to buy negative emission, right?
To clean your dirt.
To clean your dirt, right? Just like we pay somebody to clean our backyard. It is fundamentally impossible to get to net zero without carbon offsets. You can debate about scientific fact. it gets a lot of, we get, first of all, I think we get too religious about all of this, which is kind of silly in my mind, rather than being pragmatic. And the carbon offsets have a very important role to play. Take a simple use case, right? Take the airline industry. The airline industry, every airline in the world really has a net zero target. Not one of them has an idea how they're going to get into net zero, right? They all have targets for buying something called sustainable aviation fuel, or SAF, right? Which is basically a sustainable way to fly rather than jet fuel. There are a bunch of developers who are producing sustainable aviation fuel. So far, so good. The problem is the cost of the SAF is actually order of magnitude higher than Jet A, which is the conventional fuel. So the question, and that premium is called green premium in the industry. And the question is, who's going to pay the green premium, right? Somebody flew from Argentina. I mean, were they willing to pay extra if that flight had SAF? Perhaps people in this room will say, yes, we will. And we know people have done customer surveys. People say yes in surveys, but not at the price counter, right? So how does that problem get solved, right? Airlines are willing to say, well, I'll buy 10 years worth of SAF from you, developer. But the problem is the airline industry is, single-digit EBITDA margin business with shitty balance sheets, right? Their contracts are not worth the piece of paper they write them on, right? It's not bankable. Who wants to lend 10 years to, shitty airlines? So how can you solve the problem? You say, you know what, airlines, that's fine. You sign the contract, right? What you can do is if you actually fly your plane with SAF, you get to sell that as a SAF certificate to, let's say, JP Morgan, okay? Let's double count it, who cares? That helps you get your net zero commitment. That gets JP Morgan get to our commitment. Let's double count it, right? So let's not kind of get, again, religious about it. Again, that's just a preamble why carbon offsets have a role to play. And where maybe blockchain has a role to play is a real issue with carbon offsets is kind of one of provenance and, avoiding double count, et cetera, because that same tree in Brazil gets counted by 17 different people as an offset. So perhaps blockchain has a role to play there, right? You bring blockchain technology and scale the carbon offset market and make it less a religious debate and more a pragmatic issue. I think that could be a quite important use case.
One of the things that I think about as you say that is if I can make an analogy to medicine, when you're desperately ill, you don't want the one drug that will be super efficacious and treat. Give me everything you've got. I just need to get better right now, and then we're going to figure it out. When we have the time and when things start to get better.
Oh, absolutely.
It's a bit of a triage place right now. So part of that is data, and you talked about the importance of data, and I'm imagining MasterCard has a little data. What is the role of that data piece in helping to sort of ensure that all of this is done well and we can track it through and scope 3 and all these other things that we talk about, because you're deeply involved with this in the way that transactions are managed. And so one of the things that you had mentioned was that, garbage data in, garbage data out. What's the role of a transactions company like MasterCard in doing that? And do you think there's a role there?
Yeah. Without question, I think there's a role there. When you think about who MasterCard is, we have a carbon footprint. We've set a net zero goal. Is that going to change the world? It's not. We're too small. We're not a big manufacturer. But again, what we can do is with that value chain that I described, anchored by the 3 billion cardholders, how do we drive sustainable consumption across that whole network, including the 90 million merchants? And so that's really where our sustainability strategy is focused. We have kind of the first iteration of a carbon calculator that we offer to our issuers. So our issuers, at the end of the month, when you, as a cardholder, get your bill, you can see the total that you've spent. And then you can also see the total estimated carbon of that spend. And right now, again, how good is that data in our carbon calculator? It's at the sector level. We need to move it to the merchant level, and we have a plan for that. But ideally, we get down to the SKU level, right? Because that's where the data as an individual is most powerful. You can make a better decision if you really understand what is the carbon footprint of your purchase. And of course, we bundle. So you go to the grocery store, you buy 10 items, it transacts through the MasterCard. We don't see what items you bought, we just see the total of your spend. So if we don't align up with the merchants and come to some alignment of what data are we using, do we trust the merchant data to then move through our network to populate at the end post-transaction, like that's the vision that we need to get to. So that everybody is making a conscious choice, they're educated, they're informed, hopefully inspired to make a better, more sustainable decision, starting at the very beginning of the purchase process all the way through. And if we get to that, to that kind of nirvana, right, this world where we can see not just the financial impact of a purchase, but the cost, the environmental and the social cost of a purchase, then I think that really elevates how we together can create a sustainable, regenerative future for everyone. But again, the data piece is the key. So the way we're tackling that is thinking about which sectors, one, can have the most impact and are ready to move down to that SKU level faster. So airlines were mentioned earlier. Right now, if you go to Google and you search for an airline ticket from San Francisco to Argentina, it populates and shows you a carbon footprint for that. That data is getting better, and we know the airline industry is one of the heavier impacts of carbon. So it's a good place for us to start. So we're looking at that sector by sector. How do we find the most trusted data that's verified not just by the merchant itself, because again, greenwashing in, greenwashing out, we need to make sure that today, even on our own MasterCard, billions of transactions every day between people who don't know each other. And the reason that works is you trust the network. If we start moving with data that is not credible, that gets attacked and doesn't have the right integrity, then the whole process fails. So very focused on this, working with a lot of partners to innovate how we take it sector by sector.
Yeah, yeah, go ahead.
Right, maybe JP Morgan MasterCard idea here. I think, look, carbon is going to
Do I get a percentage on that?
Yeah. 2%. To me, carbon is going to be the next calorie. Everything we consume is going to have a carbon count on it, right? The sandwich we eat for lunch should have a carbon number on it. We will get there, right? And a credit card which says at the end of the month, here's my bill, and here's kind of my carbon footprint for the month, and gives the consumer a choice. You can get your cash back, or you can actually use that whatever rewards
retire
you
your
have
carbon
to buy carbon offsets on a blockchain, right? For example, that's the world we need to get to, and I think we will get to that.
One of the, and I think that helps us towards a word that you used was decision, right? When we get from sort of your bill level to SKU level, we're getting more detailed information. For actual carbon counting, that's really important. But for many folks making a decision, we're not trying to necessarily count specific kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalents. We're trying to decide between two purchases or two options. And often just knowing what the difference is, even though it's not exactly right, is incredibly helpful to decision making. And so I think there's a lot we can do even before we get to the exact right number to help consumers make good decisions, even though we might not be able to say it's exactly this number yet. And it kind of gets us towards the whole, it's a crisis. And so how do we get there sooner? So speaking of decisions, Ashby, this, I guess it's now up to 200 trillion or maybe 250 numbers, growing by the minute.
Yep.
Who are the decision makers in those spaces? What kind of information do they need to allocate that magnitude of capital in the ways that we think about here?
So much of what's just been said is incredibly powerful because it provides an opportunity to begin to integrate a lot of what has been externalities ignored. This notion of carbon is the new calorie inside of an investment decision. That's fabulous. I love that concept. The challenge that we face in my space.
I don't know, I'm not that good at watching calories, so I don't know if that's.
Yeah, I'm not either. But when you think about high technology and investing, I think people have in their mind a trading floor where there's, somebody with like 12 screens in front of them. And that is terrible technology, okay? That is a recruitment ad for an undergrad to work at a bank. That is not sophistication. Because the
Better than
computer,
working at Google.
the computer that is making sense of all of that, those 12 screens, the carbon and the social impact and all these things, the computer's this, it's the human brain, okay? And the analogy that I often use about what I hope happens in this space is personal navigation. If you go back to the 90s, 80s, those of you in the room that remember that long back, we had these things called paper maps. And
An atlas.
yeah, and you would open them and go places with them. And you had to be pretty good at using them. And in fact, you often had to have knowledge on which streets had the lights that were timed. When the high school got out, you wanted to avoid that street. That was knowledge that was really valuable. In fact, in London, taxi drivers take a test called the knowledge. And what happened between the 90s and today is this, okay? This little thing is the ultimate integrator of clean data. We got a GPS, so we know where we are. And actually, it's surprising. You start to realize with GPS, you didn't think you were somewhere where you thought you were. But also, we can start to plot where we're going, and we can build optimizations around that. In the investment business, we are living in the 90s right now. We don't have a GPS flashing. Okay? People don't know where they are. No offense to JP Morgan, but the custodians are not providing great data to the investment universe. The alternatives managers we heard earlier, there are no transformers for that data, okay? It's still sitting in PDF. So most investors are having to do this Herculean effort to simply get a sense of where they are. They're pointing at a map and they're like, I'm in the Bay Area. That's not valuable to change portfolios. And when I think about sustainable digital finance, what I want to do is use digital tools to change portfolios. If we can't change a portfolio, then digital finance is simply about reporting. That's neat. You're reporting what you own, but you want this information to flow into a decision maker, them to look at their portfolio and say, wow, I didn't realize I had that exposure to Florida real estate. I better figure out a way to get out of that. Now we're putting a price on climate change and we're shifting portfolios. Until we can get that flashing portfolio positioning system in place and begin to model scenarios into the future, we're really not going to shift that $300 trillion, I think, at this point, into anything that looks sustainable, because we're basing all of our decisions on the person who knows the shortcut using the paper map. We're still in that world right now in finance. We still rely on the CFA, the Kaya, the PhD, the track record. I already said it all. That is the world of the person who is the co-pilot in the car who knows the shortcut. That's not the data-driven mentality. The data-driven mentality is Waze, Google Maps, collective intelligence, digital decision-making.
Sorry to
Yeah.
disrupt your
No,
flow.
that's all right.
I wonder whether you'll agree with this. Right? If you look at pretty much any other industry, right? Look at the car industry. Cars were invented in 1910. Right? Seat belts were invented in 1964 or something like that. Right? The unfortunate reality of climate or sustainability is the bureaucrats have come there too soon. Right? They haven't allowed for innovation to happen, mistakes to be made, and then come and regulate. That's how, literally, right? Any industry, you have decades of innovation, mistakes get made, and then the bureaucrats come in and say, no, you're going too fast. Unfortunately, the bloody bureaucrats have come here too soon with their disclosure requirements and rules and this and that, right? And they're stifling innovation, right? At JP Morgan, as a global bank, I have 17 people who work for me Their only job is to look at the regulatory environment around the globe, around ESG. And then telling the regulators that what you're asking me to do in the EU is exactly the opposite of what you're asking me to do in Brazil or Singapore or wherever else, right? So we have caught ourselves in this really unfortunate position, right? So we are not moving from this analog world to the digital world, as Ashby said, because all we are doing is responding to all the nonsensical regulatory requirements. So I wish the bureaucrats were a little slower, but unfortunately they're already here.
Yeah. I'm going to turn it out to the audience for a question soon, but one of the things that I'm not a genie, so I only get to grant you one wish. If you had one wish, and we're going to start with you, Lauren, so if you had one wish of what you could make happen to try to push this idea forward today, what would it be? And make your wishes good, because you only get one. But the wonderful thing about this question is your wish can start to become our directive on what research and what partnerships and what things we really need to work on, because we're here to make dreams come true. So, all right.
That is literally JP Morgan's slogan, by the way.
We're here to make dreams come true?
Indeed.
Oh, wow.
So thank you.
Hey, there you go. You get a percentage on that too, right?
Yeah.
All right, Lauren, what's your
You're
wish?
kind of like an incubator here, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, my one wish. This is hard. So off the cuff, I think actually, which is maybe a little bit of a theme this morning, and not to be too religious about it, but standards. I think, when you look at ESG broadly, people are looking at it through so many different lenses, and there's so many different ways to measure that. I think last year, actually, the University of Zurich did a study that was something like 54% of ESG ratings agencies where you only had 54% had indicators in common compared to credit rating agencies, which have 99% of indicators in common. So, how can we sort of figure out solving it if we're not all measuring the same things or looking at the problem in the same way? So, even for us in the blockchain space, I mentioned that kind of Bitcoin misconception earlier. We set out to say, okay, last year, how do we worked with PwC actually, how do we come up with a framework that anyone could use to say, how could you measure your network and know, what its environmental footprint was? And that was something we wanted to give to the industry, because we think having a common standard across all of the companies who are working on the same thing, so you can talk about it in the same language, is really important. So I think for me, if I had one wish, it's that we would sort of have more of a framework or standards to all kind of operate by that would guide the conversation.
So you want standards. Rama, I think your point was that not that standards are bad, it's that having different standards for every single thing that are always changing all the time makes it a very difficult environment.
Yes, and we are too, I think, the thought process is too premature to set standards, to be honest, right? Because we just don't know the scope of the issues involved.
And I think that's the point of kind of what we're thinking about working on, is to get to that point so that wish can be made in a responsible way. Ellen, what's your wish?
No surprise. But
4 billion
clean-
cardholders.
True. Working on that with financial inclusion. But clean, trusted, granular, verified data. And if we can get to that, which I do think standards and some of the regulation that's happening is helpful to this, but we need everyone to be patient with us as we innovate. So like we have with our carbon calculator today, we know the data in the carbon calculator, it's trusted, it's verified, but it's not granular, right? And so as we move through this process and learn how to get to that desired state, making sure that we've got the right conditions for society to allow us to innovate as we get to that phase.
Great. Standards, data. What do you want, Ashby?
Translations. I want to translate.
You want a Rosetta Stone.
I do, between the ESG sustainability movement and dollars and cents reality of finance. So my world can't change their portfolio unless they can point to a change in financial performance. It's a fiduciary duty thing. They rely on it constantly to ignore what's happening in this room. But the reality is, over a long enough time horizon, it will, obviously, climate change is going to change the risk in your portfolio. It's going to affect, what you pay for insurance to protect your portfolio, all those things. But we still need to do the work to translate what a climate risk that is deemed as red actually means in terms of future insurance costs, damage projections, and the same is true for every single development goal. You know, we need those translations to make their way into the hands of the key decision makers.
Sure. Rama, what's your wish?
Abolish the term ESG.
Okay.
It's happening already, I
I
think.
hope so. One thing the politicians will get us to,
Not
I
the
think,
concept,
quickly.
but the word.
The word. Right? The term is overused, misused, abused.
Very
right?
loaded.
There are too many things. You know, there are 17 UN SDGs. There you keep going, and there are 250 things. There is no subset of the world population in anywhere which will ever agree on 250 things, or to any 250 things. Right? It's just not going to happen. And then we keep debating things, right? Is ESG good or bad? ESG is not one thing, right? So you have to kind of, get out of the word and start focusing on individual issues that are important, right? So that's one. Two, from the perspective of the program, and I think, Thomas, you had it in your slide. Interdisciplinary is a word I think you used in your slide. I can't, overemphasize that, because we are talking about finance here, but the reality is that's kind of the tail wagging the dog. There is science, right? There is physics and chemistry issues that are unsolved that we need to focus on to actually get to where we want to get to. There are public policy issues, right? Carbon tax, right? For example, that we need to focus on before we get to where we, right? There are consumer preference issues. So there are so many things. If you simply sit in a place and say it's all about capital and finance, I think that just is not the right approach. So focusing on interdisciplinary nature of it, building stronger bonds with the other departments here, I think that's just absolute must. And you obviously have the luxury of, a fantastic university.
Yeah. That's a great advertisement for our new Door School of Sustainability, because that's exactly why we tried to focus on
Absolutely.
that. Yeah. Our wish was $1.1 billion, and wish came true. All right, final. Juliet, what is your wish?
Eliminate the green premium. As long as we have sustainable products and services that cost more than the standard products, a green premium exists. And a green premium leads to a rabbit hole, which means governments have to raise taxes to be able to pay that premium. It's just not sustainable in itself. So we've got to create an environment that allows innovation to continue on its pathway to eliminate that premium. So to the point where, for example, SAV, which is sustainable aviation fuel, comes to the same cost, right, per liter as jet air. Okay. And it's not going to happen unless it's a combination of product innovation, commercial innovation by companies, as well as from a policy perspective that, maybe to your point, regulation kind of takes a little bit of a backseat and says, let's allow these guys to keep developing. Because once you come in and you put slam the hammer of regulation, then you ossify everything. And it's almost like it's baked in iron that SAV has for the next 100 years to be always more costly than jet air. But if innovation was allowed to continue, then perhaps we'll get to a point when it is actually cheaper than jet air.
Yeah, that's a wish I would love to be able to grant. Indeed. All right, I'm going to open it up for just one or two questions. Oh, you got a mic down here? Oh, look at this. We're ahead. Wow, man. All right. And if your question's for a specific panelist, please go ahead and address it.
Hi, this is Jonathan Naiman with Sistana. And Sandy mentioned that data is really a factor of production now. And data centers are the fastest growing source of electric demand in the world, on every continent except Antarctica. And so I'd like all of the panelists to talk about their efforts to innovate on the actual energy used for cooling. And I'll just note in passing, as a person who's worked in solar, cooling consumes several times more than all the renewable energy that's produced.
Sure. So just to
So,
I'll
so
take it.
to clarify, what are you doing on sustainable cooling, which is a major outcome of digital transformation?
Just to be
financing
clear,
and application.
it was President Xi that said that data was a factor of production.
Yeah, well, I'm saying, hey, Sandy's quoting it. I'm saying, hey, that's great.
I understand.
But it's a good lead-in. It's a good lead-in that this is actually a fundamental feature of the digital transformation, and as it accelerates in developing countries, the cooling crisis will get greater.
So as a panelist, I can say what I'm doing. I sit on the technical advisory board for a couple of companies that are not looking at wind and solar. We don't think that's a viable alternative for cooling. It's just too intermittent, and utility scale storage is not going to scale that way. Therefore, we're looking at a lot of geoheat and trying to understand how we use heat from deep in the earth, which is everywhere if you go deep enough. And cooling is not a thing, heat is a thing. And we just rely on your typical Carnot cycles to deal with that. And so absolutely technology is coming down the way.
I have, so I'm on a task force that WEF set up around the built environment. So I think, first of all, you start with the built environment, which is what actually drives the need for the cooling. So a lot of what we're looking at is what kind of policies do you put in place to ensure that the built environment, of course, buildings like this, or what other kinds of projects, that you take into consideration the energy requirements. And that's baked into both the regulatory side as well as the building design and so on, all the way to, of course, where by the time the buildings are decommissioned. So that's one way of addressing the cooling problem, by reducing the requirement for the cooling in the first place.
I might add to that if
Please go ahead.
Look, again, clearly the answer is not, cutting down on data centers. That is going to be the engine of growth for global economy. So simple things, there are technologies, but the other thing we are doing is, at a bank like ours, right, there are certain activities that are just time bound, right? We are trading the markets. We have to trade when the markets are open, right? And we can't just, that is what it is. But when we are sending our customers a monthly credit card bill, that doesn't need to happen during peak hours, right? That bill can be generated when electricity demand on the grid is lower, right? So how do we optimize for that and make sure that we are kind of get the renewable to go as far as it can by spreading the load is something we are actually spending a lot of time on.
I want to get to one last question right here with the microphone. We have two microphones now that are out, so we got time for one question because lunch is going to be served, and I don't want, so pick whichever one you want, So Young.
Yes. So my question is to pretty much all the panelists, but specifically to Ashby. Is data-driven decision-making an optimal way to innovate? You mentioned there's a whole bunch of noise in the pension plan space, and if you have high AUM, you're going to end up paying a lot of fees. And so for example, is past performance a good indicator of what's going to happen in the future? And if you want to innovate, does data give you the projection and the foresight to go in a specific direction? If you want to build a future, this is what I guess the imperative is here. If you want to build a future, can data give you that insight? And if that was the case, would you ever have a Facebook? Would you ever have a Google? Would you ever have a Microsoft? These founders didn't have any data to present, but they had an insight, they had an inclination, they had an intuition which was not data-based. It was not married into history. And so if you want to create something new, true innovation, does it come from data? You can get inspiration from it, but can you marry left brain thinking with right brain thinking in order to propel the boat forward in a direction that is not currently visible through the current data that's prevalent?
The data inside pension plans is not useful if you're using it to predict the future. It's useful to identify problems that need to be resolved. So most of the innovation in this space emerges out of crises. So liability-driven investing emerged out of the perfect storm in 2002. Factor-based asset allocation emerged out of the crisis in 2008. We'll see what we get here. I thought it was going to be a sustainable revolution, but there's a big backlash happening right now. So the data is to go in and spot the problems, the crises that are there. I promise you. The gender, racial diversity question of portfolio managers is there. The climate crisis is there. The overpaying intermediaries is there. What's not there is the transparency to reveal it to this room. Without that transparency, there isn't enough pressure on the boards of directors to spend the money to do anything new. So the data reveals the problem forces what are often political actors to take a difficult decision and reallocate resources to shift CalPERS money out of hedge funds and into sustainable whatever. That's the point of the data.
So look, in a micro sense, right, very, very important point. When we go talk to clients, right, corporate clients in various sectors, and say, present a thesis on you may want to change behavior, right, decarbonize your business, the first question any CEO will ask is, well, show me how it creates value, right? And the reality is you can't look at data and say, look, yet at least, that companies that have actually successfully decarbonized their business model trade better, right? But that's what distinguishes a good CEO from a bad. But the bad CEO says, well, I don't have the data, I'm going to wait, right? And the good CEO says, I have conviction that the data, if I wait though, for the data to actually prove it, it's too late, right? So that's what will decide winners and losers. People who have the conviction can learn from the data, but know where the world is going, and then kind of position themselves for that, rather than waiting for the data to prove out the thesis, which is definitely too late.
Lauren, last quick comment.
Yeah, I was just going to say, just to add to that, which is, I think data kind of gets you to a point where you can see the gap, but do you ultimately know are consumers going to adopt your thing? Are consumers actually, some people still put their money in a shoebox, even though there have been checkbooks or debit cards forever. So the actual changes, I think, in human behavior are a lot more nuanced than that. And you still need people to take a chance based on what the data indicates and see, does it work or not work?
Yep, sure.
I would just say, to your point around perfection versus momentum, and that's where we're at again with my example of the carbon calculator. We are not at perfection. We're at momentum. What do we have now that we know that we can use to drive solutions forward? And so I think, that's where we're driving. It's about momentum and how can we accelerate and move as fast as possible. We can see the problem. We don't have all of the data, but we're moving anyway.
Well, as we can see, there is a lot to talk about, but there is also the final wrap-up session. So join me in thanking our panelists this morning.